Hello friends, welcome to Wipment Technologies. So today we are going to discuss how we can send data from view to the controller. So let's take a scenario that we have a UI on the browser, and from that UI we need to take input from the user and we need to submit that form on the server, or we can say in the other words we need to post that form on the server. So how we can send data, or in other words we can see how we can post that form from that UI to the controller, right? So for sending data from view to the controller, we have these five different methods we can see on the screen. We are having using parameters, using request object, using form collection, then strongly binding, and then using JS, right? So these are the different ways from which we can send data from view to the controller, or we can see from the UI to the controller on the server side, right? So without wasting time, let's look into the picture. So let's go to the Visual Studio and let's create one new project as we used to do always. And this time let's name it view to controller, as we are going to work on this, that how we can send data from view to controller, right? And clicking on the OK button, choosing the empty one, creating the MVC empty application. So we can see on the screen our empty MVC application is ready. Now let's go to the controller and add a new controller without wasting any time, and let's name it home controller. Any meaningful name we can give. And for this controller, for this index section method, let's go and simply add a view, and our view is added successfully, right? Let's go to the controller. So let's create one action method which is going to, and let's name it, we can name it submit, submit using parameters, right? If you see in the slide, now we are going to discuss all these methods one by one. So firstly, we are going to discuss how we can send data from view to the controller using parameters, right? So let's go to the project, and I have created one simple action method, submit using parameters, and it is expecting two parameters. So let's take it. Let's let's say first name and last name, right? And this action method is going to return of type string. So let's make it string return type. And now this time it would be returning string. So let's write string over here, and let's write using parameter, right? Right. We are going to return it. And what we are going to return it? Your first name, then plus your last name, right? So we are simply creating these two fields, and these two fields we are going to create on the this view, index view. So let's go to that index view now, right? And simply here we are going to create one simple form, we can say, right? And for creating one simple form we can either use using form, right? And inside this we can make use of HTML dot begin form. So with the help of this we can create one simple form, or without this we can create our simple form, right? So as of now I'm taking this option, begin form. And if you see this, this begin form is basically expecting these overload parameters. So let me define, we can see. we can see that it is expecting first of all action name and the controller name. So to which action and to which controller will this form going to hit, right? So we need to define accordingly, right? So we are going to work with the home controller, so we need to define home controller over here, and inside this we are going to hit the first action method, because we are going to discuss how we can send data from this view, from this index view, to the home controller, to this controller action method, right? So we need to pass this action method name over here in this parameter, right? And now in this form we are going to simply create, we are going to simply take two field, whatever we have taken in this action method, first name or last name, right? So according to our need, we can define. So let's create one input type, and that should be type of text, because this is a text box control, right? And let's type, we need to define the name of this input, right? And remember one thing, that this name of this text field, right? Name of this input should match whatever we have passed in this parameter, right? So we have taken this first name, so the name of this input should also match over here. If it doesn't match, then it will not work, right? So while using with parameters, while using this method, we need to pass exact same name in this, right? So let's create one more input. We can say a last name, right? And this time we are going to name it last name. And for submitting this form, we have simply created this small form. So for submitting this form, let's create one input type of, this will be of now submit type, because we are going to submit the form, right? And the value we can assign that click me or any meaningful message, right? So that's it. So we have simply created one small form, we can say a simple form having first name and last name, and this form is going to submit, this form is going to hit, or this form is, we can see this form is going to submit the data on this home controller and this action method. So when the data will be passed from the UI, and when we will click on this submit button, then the control will hit to this action method inside this controller, right? To this action method inside this home controller, right? So that's it. So just to differentiate, let me write one header for that, that we are using this approach, send using parameters, right? To make it differentiate. So this is the first one approach. So let's save the changes and run the application. And before running, let me place a breakpoint over here so that you can easily understand. Yeah, and one more thing, that when we are going to submit this form from view, from client to the server, or we can say from view to the controller, right? So when we are going to submit this form, we need to make that request of post type, right? So before hitting this action method, we need to make this action method of type post. So we need to define attribute on this top of this action method by defining that it will be of http or post type, right? So by defining this, now we are telling the application when when this data will be hitted, right? When the user is going to hit this submit button, then the request will hit to this to this home controller and this action method. So now save the changes, and now let's run the application to see whether it's working fine or not. So application has been loaded, and we can see we are having this form, first name and last name, right? So let's define weapon, and let's take last name, and let's click on this click me button. Now we can see our control is hitting to this action method, and in the parameter it is, yeah, it is having the first name and last name value, whatever we are passing, right? We can see over here first name and last name, right? Now hitting on this button, we can see using parameters Vipin Kumar, right? So this is how we can send data from view to the controller. This is basically our view, right? We are taking the input from the user, and then we are finally clicking on the submit button, and then it is going to hit this action method. So this is how we can send data from view to the controller using parameter approach, right? So let me put break tag over here to make it more beautiful, right? And now we will be discussing our next approach, that using request object, how we can send data from view to the controller using request object. So for that, let's go back to our project and let's create one more section or one more simple form using request object. Now this time we would be using the method using request object, right? So for that, we have simply created one new form using request object, and now this time it will be hitting to to new action method. So let's define one more action method using request object, right? And this action method will be of same post type, right? And now this time we need to define using request object, right? And when we need to send data from view to the controller using request object, in that case we don't need these parameter, right? Because itself in the request object it would be coming. So let's take a string, and this time we need to fetch data using request object, right? So in the request object, it it would be coming, right? And over here we can fetch the data in the from the request object, right? Similarly, we can get data using this request object for last name also, right? Remember that these key names should match with these name whatever we have defined in the view in this form, right? So these names should match with these parameters, right? Otherwise it will not work. And for this we need to define over here last name. So that's it. So we have simply created one new action method of type post, and it is going to submit using request approach, right? So let's save this, and now this time we are having this using request, right? Save this, and now this action method we need to pass where. Let's copy this action method name, and now we need to pass this over here, because this time it is now going to hit this form using request object inside the same home controller, right? So let's save the changes and run the application. So let's see into the picture what it's going to give the output. By default, it is going to call home controller and the index action method, which will load the form, right? Yeah, we can see. Now we are using this time second approach, send data using request object. So let's pass weapon. Now this time we pass it this, and now let me put a breakpoint over here to make it more understand, right? So let's go to the form. Let's click on this button. Now this time if you see, this time control is hitting to this submit using request action method. And if you see, our we are getting the data in the first name and in the last name, right? Now let's click on the this button, and now we can see using request we are getting the data first name and last name. And in the URL if you see, we are having home controller and the action method name is submit using request. When we click on the back button, now if we want to use, if we want to post data using parameters, so same we can do weapon, and now this time we can pass this, then click me on this button. Now this time it is hitting first action method, that is submit using parameters, and accordingly we can display the output on this browser, right? So this is how we can send data from view to the controller using parameters first approach, and then second approach is your request object. But remember one thing, by using these two approaches, uh, there might be chances of spelling mistake, because I have already told you that these parameter first name and last name, that should exactly match whatever we are passing in the input field, right? These name, right, first name and last name, these should be, this should exactly match with these parameters, right? Otherwise it will not work, right? So now let's see if the changes. And now let's discuss our third method, that is using form collection. How we can send data from view to the controller using form collection. So for that, let's go back to the project and now let's create one more simple form. So for that, we need to create one more simple section, right? And this time it would be, now this time we would be sending data using form collection, right? So for that, we need to define form collection, and our input controls will remain same, first name, last name, right? And this time it is going to hit same controller, but the action method would be your form collection. So let's write it. So when now this time when the user will click on this submit button into this form, then the control will hit to this action method, submit using form collection, right? So accordingly, we need to create one new action method. So let's create one new action method, right? And this action method is also going to be of type HTTP post, right? And this time we need to change the action method name, submit using form collection, right? And now we are following the third approach, how we can send data using form collection, right? So let me copy this, right? And now when the user will hit this submit button using this form, right, then the control will hit to this submit using form collection action method to this, right? And for that, we are going to send data using form collection. So we need to pass form collection over here, and we need to create object of this form, right? And simply, now this time we don't need this. We can simply create, we can simply call it object form dot first name, right, over here, and object form dot last name. Before doing this, we need to do one more thing. Let me remove this. So after creating an object of this form collection, we need to simply, let me copy this and paste it over here. And now this time we are getting data using form collection. So we need to pass object form, right? And then we need to pass this time first name. Similarly, we need to fetch basically data for the last name, right? So remember that these key should match with these name, whatever we have defined over here in the view, right? And let's define it last name. So that's it. So what we have done, we have created one simple action method that is of post type, and this action method is going to have form collection object, and this form collection object is going to hold the data, whatever data we are going to pass in this form, right? Right. So and accordingly we are displaying, we are assigning this data into this variable. And accordingly, in a normal scenario, in a real scenario, when we are working in the industry, when we are taking the input from the user from the view, and it is going to hit this action method in this controller, right? So after fetching data into this variable, then over here we can make a database call. From here we can make a database call, right? Database call here by calling our different logic layer, that is we can say our business logic layer or data access layer, and we can save the data accordingly in our database, right? So we need to make a database call here. But as of now, I'm not supposed to here to tell you about this database call that we will be discussing in our upcoming video. So as of now, I'm going to make you understand that how we can send data from view to the controller and what are the different ways. So right. So let's see if the changes. Now this time this time we have already created this. So save the changes, and now let's see into the picture using this third approach using form collection. By default, it is going to load home controller and the index section method. If you see our home controller and the index section method, this is index section method, and this index section method is basically returning a view. Which view? This index view. So index view, on this index view we can see we are having all this form. So it will simply render the form on the view. So we can see now the third approach, send data using form collection. So let me pass, let's suppose Amit, right? We are passing first name and last name, and then click on the this click me button. Before hitting, let me please place a breakpoint. In a third approach also we can see now this time using form collection, this time it will hit to this action method. So let's see into the picture. Amit Sharma we have passed. Yeah, we can see our control is hitting to this submit using form collection action method. And if we see in this form object, it is having a key count 2, right? And we can see we are having this first name and last name. And if we fetch the value, we can see we are getting the first name in Amit and the last name Sharma, right? We can see the in the browser that using form collection Amit Sharma. So accordingly, we can choose the which approach we want to use to send data from view to the controller. Let's say now we are passing this time Amit and this time Amit Pandey, then click me, then it will hit to the request second action method, right? We can see over here, right? We can see Amit and Pandey. So let's continue. Now it is displaying that it is now using request object approach, right? So let me stop the application. So these are the different ways. And now the next method is that our strongly binding. So how we can send data from view to the controller using strongly binding. So for using strongly binding, for this we need to create one model. So let's go and let's create one model, one simple model. And inside that model, as we know that we simply create a class. So let's give it a meaningful name. Let's employee or any student class. So let's give it a employee this time. Let's create it, and inside this class let's create two properties that we have already taken in this index field. In this index view we can see first name and last name. So let's create two properties accordingly, and this time we are going to make this string, and this one is your first name and last name. So let's copy this first name and last name, right? And this will be of type string, right? So we have simply created one class, or we can say one model having two properties, first name and last name. And now let's go back to the controller, and now we want to use this employer model. We can see, you can see over here, now we want to use this employer model to the home controller. So for using the models inside this controller, we need to import the namespace. So let's write name of the application is view to controller, then models we want to use. And now this controller can use all the models, right? So for that, for this next approach that we are discussing, strongly binding, so let's create one new form. So let's go back to our index view, and let's create one more section for using our fourth approach, right? And this time it is send data using binding approach, strongly binding approach, right? And the field names will remain same. So let's save the changes and let's go back to our controller. And now let's create one more action method this time, right? And this action method will be of same post type. And now we are going to use, let's change the name of the action method, submit using strongly binding, right? So let's name it strongly binding because we are going to discuss how we can send data using strongly binding, right? And now this time, let me delete this, right? And now this time we need to pass employee object, right? Employee model. So over here, instead of this form collection, now we need to pass employee model, right? Then we need to create an object of this employee. So we can say this. And now we can simply call this employee dot first name. That's already over here, and simply for the last name. So by using this fourth approach, strongly binding, you can see uh, we don't need to take care about the spelling mistake, right? It will automatically handle because we are going to handle this by using employer model approach, right? So let's save the changes, and now let me place a breakpoint over here, and now let me copy this action method name, and we need to pass it in this fourth approach because when we are hitting this form, it is going to hit this submit using strongly binding action method name inside the home controller, right? So let's save the changes. Now run the application. So now this time we are going to discuss our fourth approach, that is sending data using strongly binding. So we can see the last one, send data using binding approach, right? So let's type Ram and let's type Sharma, right? And let's click on the click me button. So as soon as I will be clicking on this button, our control will hit to which action method? To this submit using strongly binding to this action method. Yes, right? I have already placed a breakpoint. So let's see into the picture. I'm clicking click me button, right? We can see our control is hitting to this action method submit using strongly binding, and in this employee object we can see we are getting the data first name and last name accordingly, Ram, and the last name is Sharma. And let's we can see over here also employee dot first name and employee dot last name, right? So let's click on this continue button. We can see the data. We are getting data using form collection, Ram Sharma. No, okay, we need to change the over here text, right? So I hope you got my point. We need to write over here strongly binding, right? So that's why it is displaying, right? So let's save the changes and run the application again. And now it is going to display all the forms, whatever we have discussed till now. Yeah. So let's use send data using binding. Ram. Now this time we can say Kumar. Clicking on this button, we are getting Ram and Kumar. We can see first name Ram and the last name is Kumar. So let's click on this button. So we are getting data using strongly binding Ram Kumar. Let's go back. Let's use this send data using parameter. Let's use this approach, Vipin Kumar. So it will hit to the first action methods. We can see submit using parameters, and accordingly it will display the output. Now using parameters, right? So these are the different ways how we can send data from view to the controller using parameters, using request, then using form collection, and then using binding, right? So let's go back to the project. So these are the basically different ways we can see different ways how we can send data from view to the controller, right? So in a real scenario we normally work with the strongly binding approach, because in this approach we don't need to take care about we can see that there is no chances of doing mistake with the spelling, right? We have defined the properties and this property will handle each and everything, right? But according to our need we can follow any approach in our MVC application, right? So these are the different ways. And we have see in the view, we have simply created this view, right? Sorry, this form, second form, third form, and then fourth form, right? So let me, yeah, so let me save the changes. And now let me tell you one more thing. Uh, what will happen when we will hit this form using get request, right? If you see this action method submit using parameter first approach, we have created this action method using of post type, right? So let's assume I just want to show you to make you more understand. Let's we need to pass this. We can pass over here other parameter. We need to define form method of type get or post. So this form, let's say we are going to make it of get, right? And instead of the submit button, now we are going to define button type. So now what will happen? We have simply created this form, and this input type is now of button type, and now we are going to hit this form using get request, right? So will it hit to this submit using parameter action method inside this controller? So let's see into the picture, save the changes. Let me run the application. So I want to basically make you more clear. So what is the basically use of these HTTP verbs, that is get and post? Yeah, we can see our form is loaded. Now send data using parameters. So let's pass the data. And now let me hit on this click me button. We can see I'm clicking on the button, right? I have clicked on this button multiple times, but it is not hitting to this action method, to this submit using parameter action method. Why so? Because we have made this form of get request, right? And it is going to hit submit using parameter, but this action method is of type post type. So that's why our control is not hitting to this action method, because here we are defining that it will be of get type, but in this action method we have defined that it is going to handle the request that will be of post type, right? So that's why our control is not hitting over here, right? So let's go back to our view, and now let's change it to the submit type. Now save the changes, and now let's run the application again. Let's reload the page, and now let's see whether it's going to work or not. So this time it is throwing an error. Why? We can see in the URL it is hitting home controller and this action method, but and in the query string it is sending the data. So if you remember in my previous video when I was discussing HTTP verbs over here, over there I have already told you that whenever we are working with get request, so in that case your data will be travel in the query string, right? Your data will travel in the query string, right? So that's why we are able to see data, right? But since we are passing our form that is of get type, and it should hit to this action method, but the same this action method is of type post type, so that's why it is not able to find any if you see in this form, it is not able to find this action method which is of type get. So in this controller we are having this action method, but that is of not type get request, that is of type post. So that's why it is not hitting to this action method, right? So let's go back to our browser. And one more thing, I have already told you that when we are working with the get verbs, your data will travel in the query string, we can see in the URL, And when we are working with the post type, that is your HTTP post verb, then in that case your data will travel in the body of the request. So that's why we are not able to see the data when we are using HTTP post verb, right? So let me stop the application. So in this view, so to make it work, to make this work, so we have defined this get post type. Oh, sorry, we have defined this form of get request. So for that, either we have to make this action method of HTTP get type, right? In that case, it will hit this action method, or either we have to make this, if this action method is a post type, then in this form we have to make this a post type. If we made this post type, and now let's save the changes and now run the application. So let's see into the picture, that will make you more clear. And now it will be able to find action method. We can see, take let's fill the data, right? And now let's click on this button. We can see now it is hitting to this submit using parameter action method, because now it is of type post type, and this action method is basically meant for handling the request of post type. We can see using parameters we are getting the data according to our need, right? And why it is happening? Because our action method is also of type post type, and in the view we can see this is also a post type, right? So these are the basically different ways that how we can send data from view to the controller using parameter, request, then form collection, then binding, right? And now let's go back to our slide. The last is using JS. So basically, this is basically a third party approach. Let's say we want to send data from view to the controller using JavaScript or jQuery or Knockout or Angular, right? In that case, we go for this method. So, and to make it work, let's say we are using JavaScript in our project, and in that case, what we have to do, we need to make a Ajax call over here. In this view, we need to make a Ajax call over here, and in that Ajax call, we need to pass same your URL, that is your controller and action method name. Then we need to tell the request type, that will be a post or get type in that Ajax request, and then we need to pass the data. But the problem with this approach, using JS approach, that you will be not able to debug into the controller, right? Yeah, so that's why we don't use using JavaScript, but we can use according to our need, right? So these are the basically different ways, and accordingly we can deal with the jQueries, Knockout, Angular, and we can send data from view to the controller. But when we are working in the MVC application, these are the basically different ways how we can send data from view to the controller, right? So that's it for this video. And now let's meet in the next video with a new topic. And I would like to request you to all that please like and subscribe my channel, friends, and please share please share this within your friend circle. And if you have any doubt, you can post me in the comment section. I will definitely reply to you in my comment section. So that's it for today. So let's meet in the next video. Bye bye. Take care.